Welcome to episode 3 of the Ghost Furnace podcast. Today, the conversation turns to a historically haunted inn in Harmony, Pennsylvania. If you have a paranormal experience of your own that you would like to share, please email it to us at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoy the show, please rate, subscribe, and review on whichever platform you use. Also, like and share us on Instagram and Facebook. The hosts of The Ghost Furnace are Nick, Pennsylvania, Bond, sometimes referred to as Brendan, and Mike. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
So we're talking about what's now a restaurant that has been a hotel in the past, that was a private residence. It's best known today as the Harmony Inn in Harmony, Butler County, Pennsylvania, a place the three of us are very familiar with. Bond lives just outside of town, but spends most of his waking hours there, it seems like. Mike lives directly in town, just a few blocks from the place, and at one point I ran as the mayor is kind of a joke that got a little out of hand. So the house was built in 1856 as a private residence, but by the late 1870s would be sold to the Ziegler family. The Ziegler family is a hugely important and prominent Mennonite family, which still has many family members still living in the area. It was the Zieglers that turned the house in the late 1800s into a hotel and added the bar that still exists today, as well as an addition to the back of this Italianate house. Now, here's something that I have found out, and I am very excited. I can hardly maintain myself to let you all know. In every history I have ever seen of the house, it states that it was built by Austin Pierce. That's been printed in newspapers, in several books. It's just the story that's been told. Now, Austin Pierce is a supremely interesting person because he's a Civil War veteran. He was a banker who worked for his father's bank. He was a druggist for a while, and he was a part owner of a railroad. But let me hold off on that. Here's my problem. When the home was built, Austin would have at the oldest been 13 years old. So despite the history that this home was built by Austin Pierce, I find that one of two things has to be wrong. Either the date of 1856 is wrong, which is possible, or the house was not built by Austin, but rather his father, Alfred. Now, Alfred's also really interesting. Born in England in 1816, he immigrated to the United States and eventually became involved with the Ziegler family. Though he himself was not a Mennonite, he also may have been the patriarch of the Pierce Woolen Blanket, which is one of the New World's oldest blanket companies, which for a time was purchased by Woolrich of Clinton County, Pennsylvania. And Bond, I see you nodding your head. You must be more familiar with Pierce blankets than I am, because I was not, but there was a wool mill in Harmony, the Harmony Woolen Mills, which was owned by Alfred. When this house was completed, would have been 40 years old. So it seems more likely to me, if the 1856 construction date is correct, that this house was built by Alfred, but may have likely traded hands to Austin. Immediately across the street from the Harmony Inn is a historic bank, the Harmony Savings and Loan Bank, which was established in 1868. It was established by Alfred. Now, Austin, the son, who is often credited with building the house, worked there and would eventually become, I believe, president. Now, in September 1877, Alfred would go on to Meadville College, and then he would go into the Grand Army of the Republic at the outbreak of the Civil War, serving through the whole Civil War. From all the records that I can find, he was in a corps of heavy artillery And he comes back, starts working at the father's bank. In September of 1877, he goes in with James Negley, a Union Major General and U.S. representative from Pennsylvania, in the start of this railroad that ran from Etna to Zelienople, which is the town right next to Harmony. But in August of 1879, that railroad line went up for sheriff sale. So Austin goes around, he moves to Pittsburgh for a while. He was living in Pittsburgh, where in 1895, his father, Alfred, would die in his house on Coral Street in the Bloomfield area. Then he goes off to Los Angeles for a little while before he returns to Pittsburgh, and he dies in 1914. Now, just a couple other things real quick. Alfred, the father, seems to have been charged in June of 1877. He was charged with embezzlement from that same bank. It seems, from what I can understand reading the legalese, that he got off as not guilty, but it's just really interesting. One final note is that both the father and the son are buried in Zelienople up on the Hilltop Cemetery. They have an obelisk, and the two and their wives are buried at that point. So that's what I wanted to let you guys know. I thought it was a big thing. And my impression is that it's more likely that Alfred built the house, but it stayed in the family. When the railroad was going broke, was around the same time that the father was getting charged with embezzlement from the bank. So it seems like they had sold the house at that point and probably then relocated to Pittsburgh. They both remained sort of magnates, being at least running and sometimes being elected to political office. So here's Alfred Pierce, the father, his obituary as it appeared in the Pittsburgh Press, November 16th, 1895. Pierce, on Friday morning, November 15th, 1895 at 9:30 o'clock, Alfred Pierce in his 80th year. Funeral services at the residence of his son, Austin Pierce, 324 Collins Avenue, East End, on Saturday evening at 8 o'clock. Interment at Zelienople, PA, on Sunday afternoon. And then from the Pittsburgh Press, this would be 19 years later, on August 19th, 1914, the son, Austin Pierce. Austin Pierce died yesterday afternoon in his 73rd year from infirmities of age complicated by neuritis at the home of his brother-in-law, Alfred Winter, 5152 Coral Street. He was born in Harmony, Butler County, and was for many years cashier at a Butler County bank, of which his father was president. He enlisted in the Army when he was in his senior year at Meadville College and served to the end of the Civil War, and since has become a member of Colonel P.B. Clark Post No. 162 Grand Army of the Republic. During the past year, in a hope to relieve himself from chronic neuritis, he went to the Pacific Coast, making his headquarters at Los Angeles, but returned to Pittsburgh about a month ago. He leaves his widow, Bertha Winter Pierce, daughter of Reverend Ernest Winter Pierce, two sons, Charles W. of Carnegie and Alfred of Portland, Oregon, and Mrs. Ada P. Ingersoll of Spokane, Washington. And that is how the story ends.
Well, now that we have some history on the building, I think we'll turn it over to Brendan and his interview. One thing that should be noted is that at this time we did not know that we could use the Harmony Inn's name, and we reached out to them and they're okay with it and they gave us permission. In the interview, you won't hear them say the Harmony Inn.
Yeah, so I had an interview with our good friend Becca, who worked at the Harmony Inn for a few years and was a server, a hostess, all-around worker there for that time. Said she had some really fun stories about the place. And we all have heard, different stories over the years and everything. So we were really excited to get a first-hand account by someone who spent hours and hours and hours there every week, hoping she accumulated some good stuff. And she really did. So now we're going to go ahead and cut to her interview. I had a great time talking to her and hearing these stories, and I think you all will too. So hey everyone, today I'm here with my good friend Becca. She has spent quite a bit of time working and patronizing a local establishment here. It has known pretty publicly for its ghost stories. We've actually even talked about it on other podcasts. But with her intimate knowledge, I wanted to have a conversation with her, kind of get her thoughts, some of her stories from like an insider's perspective. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy this conversation. So Becca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Becca Brambles, and I'm delighted to be here and share my stories. So I worked at this particular establishment for about 3 years. It beautiful, very historic, originally built in the 1800s for a prominent railroad tycoon, and it has been many things throughout the years. And whenever I first began working there, I'd heard a lot of stories, especially from the people working there, about lights going on and off, silly things like glasses coming off of the counter and things like that. So I kind of knew to expect, but I didn't really feel anything like malicious or any ill intent like that, but it was a spooky old building. One of the first experiences that I had was seeing a glass just kind of pop off the bar, walking through the bar, seating a table. And it was always kind of a funny thing because always the bartenders or whoever who was in the bar would always throw their hands up and be like, I didn't touch it, because, you never want to break a glass in the bar. Everybody's like, oh my God, the glass is broken. I was like, I had nothing to do with that at all. So, it almost becomes like a funny occurrence. And like with the lights coming on and off, there was a light upstairs where it would constantly shut itself off or turn itself on. Like you would shut all the lights off to go downstairs for the night and it would be done. And then you'd come up the next day, or your managers would be like, why did you leave the lights on upstairs? And it's like, no, I left all of the lights on. Sometimes we would come into broken glass in the bar from things happening overnight. And there was at one point someone who actually, a manager from years past, who could have sworn like every time that they went in there, because you can watch on the cameras and see what's going on in the building, the light kept like turning on and off, and they'd look in the camera and it looked like the light was on and go out, and then it would look like it was off. Just hearing all these stories and things from servers and stuff. The first real physical thing that ever happened to me was and it's simple little things, but I had a door just completely lock itself on me. We had a downstairs area that went into the bar. And if you were coming down the stairs to the left, there was a door, and I was training a real sweet girl for, I was hosting that day. And I came down and I had a bunch of glasses in my hand, and I'm looking at her as I'm talking. She asked me a question, and someone had just gone out the door to the bar. So the door had just closed, and the deadbolt is on our side of the door. So I could see the door. There's no way to lock it. And as the door closed, I put my hand on the door to finish asking her questions. And I had a stack of about 12 glasses up my arm. So I had a huge amount of glass that I'm holding, and I go to pull that door and it was dead bolted. I mean, I almost fell because I pulled back on it, and she was like, for lack of a better term, white as a ghost, and was like, how did that happen? I said, well, I don't know. And like, we were still working a wait list, and those glasses needed to go to the bar, and I basically was just like, shake and bake, I'll think about it later. but that door locked itself quite a bit, and we did at one point have a former manager that used to complain because every time that they would, whenever they were closing or getting there in the morning, whenever there'd be no one else in there, that door would seem to lock itself. It was ridiculous because you'd have to walk the whole way around the building to get through it, and there's no one there to lock it, and it just kind of became, for a while, it would do that. So that was the first thing that I actually had to like physically be like, I don't really know. And you play it off as maybe the door. Like I had a hard time actually deadbolting the door because it's like a.
So it was I don't know. Yeah. So it wasn't like, because some deadbolts like they aren't like on a spring, but they're so well oiled that as soon as they start to flip, they go the whole way. It wasn't like that. This is like
antique. Yeah. We don't use this deadbolt at all. It's probably as close to original. You're talking like probably 100-year-old deadbolt. It's like, it still goes, but it's hard. And even depending on the time of the year, with the way that the wood in the whole building.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
They live. It was the time of year. I even had a hard time getting it to lock because it didn't quite line up with the lock.
Yeah. Oh, that's wild. Yeah.
Yeah, and that door in itself constantly, because I sat right beside it, it constantly would swing. Open and close, sometimes even like 5 or 6 inches. I'd goof around sometimes because a lot of the history to the building has to do with there being quarantine upstairs in the building, and there were some children that passed away. So a lot of the entities and things that people do see and feel are children. So I would sometimes goof around and be like, can you please not? I'm sitting there trying to like figure out what I'm doing for the evening and scheduling the night or the wait list, pardon me. And all that kind of stuff. And the door's like, and it's like,
you're just trying to work, you know?
yes. Like I have a child. I'm like, can you not? But yeah, it was very, you know, that kind of childlike thing in the door swinging back and forth. The first actual time that I saw something, it was around the holidays, and we were always really busy. Or no, it wasn't around the holidays. The next story is around the holidays, because this was springtime, because I specifically remember we had just watched a couple hours before a baby bird take flight out this one upstairs dining room window.
Aww.
We all stood there and cooed. Yes, me and all the servers. So that there's a definite point to why I'm talking. So I'm seating all these tables, and I'm working the list and seating all these people, and all of a sudden I look over, and I love like just talking to people, hostess with the mostest. I was always, goofing around. So I saw a little grandmother, this little woman, and this beautiful woman, and I was so excited to talk to her. She had like this little knit shawl. She reminded me of my great grandmother. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, we had her upstairs. She must be sightseeing. You know what I mean? Because a lot of times people stay downstairs. And I sat my table quick as I could. I said the soups. And as soon as I turned around, it was like I saw her out of the corner of my eye. She was looking out that window, clear as day. I didn't think anything weird. I just thought there's a person there. And then 5 seconds later, I turned around and I didn't see her, because I was like, oh, I want to tell her about that baby bird. The nest is still there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I didn't see her. And I went to, because there was another room that connected, I went to kind of like head her off at the pass out the hallway. She was nowhere. It wasn't until like I stood there for like an entire minute being like, did she go down the back stairs? Like, which, you know what I mean? Like we have these twisty back stairs to the kitchen. Like, where'd she go? I was standing there like, where did this woman that just disappear to? And I spent the rest of the day just kind of thinking about that. And it wasn't like until later on in the moment that I really realized that, she probably wasn't there. But it was another one of those things that during the time, I'm like, oh, well, I got 15
You don't think twice about it. Yeah. You just
and I was off my way. And then I was looking for her in the restaurant. It really wasn't until later, because I was still thinking, whenever I said, who go down the back steps, I'm like, I have a hard time going down those stairs. Like, I knew I didn't know where she went. I just figured she disappeared and I'd see her, and I did not see her for the rest of the day. But even now that I think about it, it was such an odd, we have a very large flight of stairs, and we do not get elderly upstairs. We don't get a lot. There's a lot of people that don't like to go upstairs that aren't even elderly, issues with neither, whatever, So I was surprised. That was a very, very, different experience. I continually think about that. And then the next one, that's
pretty crazy. I mean, that's pretty crazy, because like you were saying, you didn't even think anything of it at the time. It's not like you saw some spooky ghost that like scared you and startled you. You just thought there was a nice old lady looking out the window, that's wild. That's wild.
And I actually stuttered talking to the table, because whenever I glanced back over and noticed she was gone, I was like, what is she, Sonic the Hedgehog? Like, where is she going so fast? Like,
exactly.
So I was flabbergasted. I was like, where did she? Yeah.
Wow.
So, that was, and it wasn't, and they don't happen all the time. It was months until I had something else where I thought, and upstairs was kind of different. And even after we closed up the upstairs dining rooms and stuff like that, and all the lights were shut off, no, I didn't like to go up there by myself. Not that you would go up there and like get scared or it was spooky, but I mean, sometimes you would, and not every time, sometimes I would like go up there and not think about it and just like, oh, and then be like, oh, wow, I just used the upstairs bathroom after dark and no one's up here, and I'm a big girl.
Yeah.
Walking back down the stairs. And then other times I would like go running up there because there'd be menus or whatever sitting there. And then I'd hit those top 2 steps and I'd go, maybe not.
Yeah.
And I'd like grab them like a 3-year-old, like shutting off the bathroom light. And I'd like run down those stairs, like, dun, 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 dun. But it wasn't all the time. And even then it wasn't like a scary feeling. It was just an awareness. And there are upstairs, it went through, many things. Like I said, there was a quarantine up there. It also at times was apartments and things like that. So there's lots of, energy in the building. Another time I was decorating for Christmas, and the attic has these like stairs that are like maybe 4 foot wide, maybe they're not 4. They are narrow. I'm trying to think. I'm not very good at thinking measure, but they're like narrow. I was carrying like tubs down, like tubs with Christmas stuff in them, and like my knuckles brushed the sides. So I'm like carrying all this Christmas stuff down, tree and all this stuff. So I'm walking down with this giant tub, and all of a sudden from running down the stairs, I hear little feet running down the stairs. And I got more like mom mad. Like I stood there and this little head ran past me and I actually was like, hey. And I went to go around a corner because I'm in like mom mode, people running on the stairs. I got stuff in my hands, like you can barely get around me.
Yeah.
And I'm all angry. And then I go to take 2 steps and I was like, wait a minute. I don't want to go around that corner because there was no one in that attic. It all happened so fast. It was like I like squeezed myself up because I heard the steps coming down behind me. I was the only one up there. Like the door is even like dead, but like it's locked and you have to take the lock off to go up. Like there was no way.
Yeah, like there's no way like an errant kid would have made their way up there from like a party.
And I didn't go in that dining room, but I would have heard and things like that. But it did. That was one that did kind of get. And I guess it was more just my own reaction to it, where I didn't even register, and I was more like about to give somebody a scolding and a tisk finger.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow.
So that was. And that one was really interesting because I almost tripped on the steps. And I remember standing there, I still had the thing in my hand and I was like, because occasionally we do get like, we would get kids running around or people that don't necessarily, little tiny children can get away and things like that. But it was not that. But that was definitely. And around Christmas and Halloween, there was always a really, really different energy at the entire place.
Oh, I can believe it. I can believe it.
Especially the fact, I think that, a lot of the spirits that, historically are connected to the building have to do with the family that lived there and things like that. I feel like there's like a lot of that, homey energy. And some people report seeing like a matronly woman. But it's always kind of like a welcoming, gesture-ish kind of energy and never anything really malicious or spooky, which I always thought was interesting, especially coming into working from the place, to the place, seeing this big, beautiful building and everybody's telling these ghost stories, but it's not like, holding a flashlight on your face and being like, listen up.
It's not like it's not negative. It's just
not at all
spooky sometimes.
The area is very historic in itself. And I think that whole, especially Civil War energy, and that's even, that kind of thing. It has a lot of history wrapped up in that. And just, especially I think right now, considering the fact that there was quarantining there, it just kind of shows the cycle of life in historic places. And it's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
To see how that energy still carries through. Like we're talking about it right now. And it's things that literally history and stuff like that happened hundreds of years ago. That, this building in particular, we're sitting here talking about these possible entities and stuff like that would be those people. So I just think it keeps that alive.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask, because like a lot of the just like you were saying, almost keeping it alive, because like how much do you think that the expectation of a place being haunted and having so many people coming in and out of it regularly and throughout history, how much of that do you think plays a role in these experiences?
Probably some. I mean, we would have people that would come in that were locals and stuff like that, where they don't, you know what I mean? They're not worried about it. Where they've never had an experience like that, or some of them they have, but they don't necessarily, think into it as much. And it is a place where you would get people that come for those experiences. I got to see people, how their vibes changed whenever kind of like, because we would get people who would bring people to the restaurant and wait till they're inside and be like, oh yeah, by the way, it's haunted upstairs. And I would always kind of really try to I'd always be like, well, for one, it's haunted everywhere. And for two, we are friendly ghosts here. There's like, bringing that kind of energy. And as an employee of this particular place, I really felt very proud and humbled that during this time on my, place on this earth, I got to, for a time, kind of like take care. And, even when, especially around the holidays, we're helping with the tree and the decorating and learning the history of the people that owned the home before. And, their children's spirits being in the homes and things like that. It's almost like you're just kind of like a bit of a caretaker while you're there.
Yes, yes. And
sweeping the floors for the ghosties.
Yeah. And you got to wonder if, like, especially because of all the, not only your experiences, but like I said, I've heard similar stories from other folks who have worked there over the years. You have to wonder how much that being a caretaker, you have to wonder if that makes these spirits or entities more comfortable, maybe interacting with you or showing up around you, or like the one who passed you on the stairs, like playing around you, because that maybe they do see you guys as
feeling that kind of,
because it does kind of make you part of the history of it,
Well, and I think that says a lot about the restaurant in itself, with how they try to carry the energy of keeping it, kind of keeping it connected. It's a happy place, and you can see it right down to the spirits in the bottles and the spirits in the attic.
that's a great turn of phrase, and I completely agree. You're right.
Yeah.
Because
they carry that energy.
Yeah. What would you say is the wildest story you've heard from anybody else there that you haven't experienced yourself? Just like from another person who works there, or even a patron.
The weirdest stories that I hear is that before they did some renovations downstairs, I used to hear that people would always see legs on the stairs. Like whenever you would come out, you come out beside the stairs and you would just see ghostly white legs. I've heard stories about that. I've actually.
Oh, wow.
And what really moves me the most is whenever you would have customers come in who would either say, "Oh, I'm so glad they moved that bathroom. I used to be afraid to go in." People used to remember being afraid to, go to the bathroom, because if you came out, that was like a common thing.
Was seeing those legs. That's interesting.
Was seeing legs like that. And it was enough that, even just sometimes seeing the energy of people who have had experiences there, or, like I said, I think in the 80s or something like that, it at one point had some living areas in it and stuff like that. So there were people living there, and, I had some people come in and be like, "I lived there at this point and I had this and this happened, and we used to always see this and that." And they really have these living in that experience, or to have people come in, and refuse to come in the building. They'll only eat on the patio.
Really? Oh, that's wild.
They're only coming in the summer. And these are all things just to see that.
Yeah, you can't blame them. Obviously, and that's something that, like, whether you believe the place is legitimately haunted or not, or to whatever extent, like, you can't argue that those people, aren't doing that for no reason. No. They're not inconveniencing themselves because nothing happened.
No. And I definitely do think it's a very, a high energy. I think it's a magical place no matter how you look at it. Like, if you walk into that building, it is beautiful, and it carries an energy with itself. You can see it from the outside. It is a beauty, and it is like a jewel, and you can and I really think that it carries that kind of energy whenever people come in. There is kind of that. It's such a neat and different place and everything. So that you do feel something special, even if you don't know that kind of history, if you don't resonate with that. It's still like a magical place, but it is like a different aspect of it. And I love that historical aspect, a lot of the historical aspects of that whole area, and how it just kind of all fits in.
Yeah, no, no, I think you're 100% right. One of the things you mentioned was on the cameras, they've caught like the lights going on and off before. Are you aware of any other, obviously like a glass sliding off of a table is like physical evidence,
they've caught things that look like entities in the bar.
Oh, really?
Something moving through, because on the camera. And one time, we're all arguing and stuff, and it's like, but it looks so strange. It looks like such, and then somebody's like, "That's a dog. Look at how low it is to the ground," and we're all like, "Pupper ghost."
Oh my gosh! Oh, that would be wild.
I know.
That'd be pretty crazy.
That's how common the conversations are. Like, literally, sometimes you'd be in the bathroom and the paper towel dispenser would never want to work. Never want to work. Everybody would talk about it. And then sometimes randomly it would just start pumping out paper towels. You better thank that thing. I always did. Thank you. Like, you're not even out of the stall yet. And it's like paper towels are coming out. And instead of being like, "Oh my God," I'm like, "Thank you. Now I don't have to fight with this thing that doesn't like my hands." Like, it's just, it really got worked into work culture and joking around about that. Taking a buddy system sometimes. Some say, "You can live with me." You know what I mean? Because you have to go upstairs to like do something when after all the tables are like, all set up and the lights are all off. It's like, joke around and take somebody with you.
Oh yeah. But I think that, like you said earlier about the energy of the place,
Mhm.
Like, I think that whenever you have like a staff working there like that, that takes that approach to it,
Yeah.
like that only serves to like help that energy to both A,
Yeah.
come forth, but B, come from a positive place, you know?
Definitely. Always.
Like if you had a whole bunch of people working there that were scared the whole time, like obviously that wouldn't be good for business.
No.
It wouldn't be good for the restaurant. It wouldn't be good for the energy of the place. So
Exactly.
I think it takes a certain type of person to take that approach, which I think is a great thing, you know?
Well, and I really think the building makes it easy. Like I said, it's kind of like one of those things. Whenever I got started, I was like, "What are these said scary things that everyone's like, oh, you'll see."
Oh, you'll
and then
see.
I was like, "Oh, I guess I see."
Yeah.
But it wasn't like something, and that's even, you know, we're all kind of really kind of proud and protective of them in a way, because I've even heard, you know, I can speak for myself and some of, you know, the people that I used to work with, you know, having people come in and being like, "Oh, well, I don't like ghosts," and then it's like, well,
maybe they don't like you.
Not liking our ghosts. Like, yeah, it's like, you know, like, well, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well,
covers the ghost's ears so they don't have to hear the harsh words. Like, gee.
That's so
I'd
funny.
Never like
That's
walk
so
into
funny.
their place. Yeah, it's kind of like just carrying that respect and really,
fun.
yeah, the place has a lot of pride. Even just I feel like the building in itself is an entity, and I used to love being there, especially around the holidays. I've been missing it a whole lot. I'm actually possibly going there for Bloody Marys today because
nice.
I have been,
Jealous.
You know what I mean? And
yeah.
just missing the place so bad, and it's such a great. As soon as you walk on the grounds, you can kind of feel that history.
Yeah, well, that's wild. So, well, hey, Becca, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been a lot of fun. Again, you have such a unique perspective, being someone who worked there for so long and got to experience so much. I mean, it's a very special thing, and
yeah, truly is.
And I really do thank you for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So thank you for including.
So everyone, that was my interview with Becca. I think she had some really interesting experiences, some that I kind of expected, knowing the history of the place, and some that I didn't expect. And I think that's kind of the fun of hearing these stories, especially from someone who has such a multitude of experience at that location. You're going to get stuff you expect and stuff you don't expect. What are some of your guys' impressions?
As somebody who grew up going to the Harmony Inn, I've never actually seen anything myself there, but just to hear the stories of somebody who's worked there for so long, it was really neat.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really not surprised me, but I was really kind of pleasantly happy to hear, is that all of her interactions were of like the benign or even positive standpoint. Nothing that you would say is like malicious is going on there. The story about like the kids running around, the story about the old lady, you know, looking out the window, all the kind of stuff that you kind of like, again, kind of expect somewhere like that. You always think there's going to be something darker around the corner, and that doesn't seem to be the case. And the fact that the other employees and what it sounds like the owners treat the spirits there as tenants, you know, like this is also their home and it's part of their history. And the fact that they look at their current role as part of that living history and almost as like a caretaker rather than an owner. I think you see that a lot with hauntings. People move in somewhere and they see that there's any kind of spirit activity and they immediately assume that it's negative and they try and smudge it or get rid of it in one way or another. Where it seems like the folks that work there and spend the time there at the Harmony Inn embrace them as family and friends almost and part of a shared history, which I thought was just really refreshing. And also, I thought Becca did a good job of explaining the situations that she was in when having some of these encounters and not necessarily trying to debunk them, but I thought she did a really good job of giving good accounts of what happened to show that they weren't just mundane. Like, especially with when she mentioned the lock on that big door. We all know which door she's talking about. It's a big, heavy door. And my first thought, I think I mentioned this in the interview, was, oh, well, if it's an old structure that has a really well greased up lock, we all know that sometimes those locks can just kind of flip with almost no effort. And she very quickly was like, no, this thing is old. It's, not rusted, but it's not easy to move purposely. So the odds of it moving on its own are pretty rare. That goes to speak to something that is maybe a little more on the paranormal side of things. And I love the story with the old lady, because it evokes the idea of like, who was that? We, again, like Nick was saying earlier, this place has such a long and storied history of different people calling it home or passing through or spending time there or having important events take place. It makes you wonder who that lady might have been, And like so many times you hear about stories with apparitions, Becca's first response wasn't, oh, geez, it's a spooky ghost. You think it's just a nice old lady until you realize that like it couldn't have been there and wasn't there. So again, I was just very, very impressed with her stories and her storytelling ability. I absolutely loved her stories.
Well, that's a good place to segue, because you brought up the old lady, which she had spoke about, and that has actually been reported in newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. When they do profiles, have talked about some old woman. I was going through some newspaper archives from the 80s and early 90s and came across that. And a few days ago, we actually got a few emails from people who had listened to our first episode. And one of them, which I'll read here in a minute, comes from a lady who talks about seeing this old woman. Now, this is our first time reading a letter that came to us, but I think we should continue the tradition of whenever we get a letter that we kick this off with Mike doing his James Brown impersonation. I just think that'd be a good way to...
I don't recall this.
As old as time. Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Oh boy,
Mike, I can't do this without you.
I don't know what to do. I don't know.
Oh, okay. All right then. Well,
you had your shot. Had your shot.
So we received an email from Colleen P., who wrote to us a story about her experiences at the Harmony Inn, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. I've had several experiences at the Harmony Inn, but one of the first occurred on Halloween night 1999. My in-laws had suggested that my husband, daughter, son, and of course myself join them for dinner at the Harmony Inn. It was very busy as a popular psychic was there that night, but after a good meal, we left and went out to the parking lot. As we looked up at the second-story window, all the females in our group saw a woman twirling in the window in a white dress. Strangely, none of the males saw anything in the window. My daughter saw a young girl, my mother-in-law saw an older woman, and I saw a skeleton in a white dress. We couldn't explain it. I would tell this story to others from time to time, and one day at work, several years later, I told a coworker the story. She stared at me and said I gave her the chills. She said her mom used to tell a story of seeing a skeleton woman in a white dress spinning in the street outside her house one night. She said her family said her mom was imagining it because her own mother was ill and did die 2 months later. Then it was my turn for chills. My ill father died 2 months after I saw the skeleton lady in the Harmony Inn window. So that is our story that we received from Colleen P. And as I said, going through some archives in the newspapers, I found that this story of an old lady, a young girl, and even a skeletal woman had been reported in the 1990s in the newspapers in the region. So I found that interesting. So that is Colleen P.'s story. So thank you very much for that, Colleen. Really appreciate it. I know the two of you have a lot of thoughts, so I'm just going to be quiet and let you two hash them out.
So this story in particular has some elements of high strangeness that we haven't really had a chance to touch on yet in this podcast, which is kind of like my area. So whenever she said that she saw a skeleton whereas the other women in her family that saw it saw a woman, whereas the men did not see anything. Correct?
Right. The young girl saw a young girl, the mom saw a woman,
Yes.
and then
Yes.
Colleen saw a skeleton.
So a skeptic might say, oh, well, the fact that they all saw different things means that whatever was there, they were all mistaken, or they all saw something and all got it wrong, or there wasn't anything there in the first place.
Or they saw something and they had heard these stories because I said the newspaper archives were reporting, the newspapers were reporting these stories and have been for some time, and those stories may have influenced how they interpret it.
Absolutely. They use those kind of cultural contexts to interpret what they're seeing. Whenever we talk about phenomena like this, where you're seeing something that your brain doesn't quite know how to interpret it, regardless of where it falls on the natural or paranormal spectrum. We see all the time how unreliable eyewitness testimony is in getting things right a lot of times. What this goes to show is that when we talk about the co-creative element of some of these experiences, like Nick was just saying, you're seeing something and you're using cultural context and clues to interpret what you're seeing. I would say that really does explain what they're seeing, because what's happening, I think, is each person is seeing something that they can't wrap their head around. Like their eyes don't know what they're looking at. And we've all had experiences like that, whether, again, natural or paranormal, where your brain kind of tweaks out a little bit because it doesn't have a previous context to put what you're seeing into perspective for you. So what then can happen is your brain, almost like a video game, has like different, or any kind of like when we talk about 3D animation and stuff, you have like a skeleton basically, and then the artists basically put a skin on top of it. I propose that's kind of what your brain is doing in situations like this. That's what accounts for how crazy some of the things people see are. When the lady saw it, her brain went skeleton. When the other people saw it, they went woman in white. When the little girl saw it, she went little girl like me. And I think that is a very interesting element that we see in lots of paranormal stuff that is almost unexplainable, because you have these, like you were saying, Nick, these cultural elements and things that can kind of cue you in. That's maybe why the older folks saw things that had been reported, whereas the girl who didn't have those cultural contexts saw something that just made more sense to her.
Well,
that hadn't been reported previously.
This is one of those things that makes a lot of sense to me, because I have so much doubt as to the existence of this whole paranormal realm. But that doesn't, like, I try to walk the line because I don't doubt that people saw things.
Oh, yeah.
But it's just what our minds do to make sense of what we do see. I don't doubt what Colleen saw, but there's the other interpretation, which, like, is a skeleton woman, like a harbinger. And I know, Mike, I said I'd be quiet, and you got something to say.
Well, just something I wanted to point out. The relationship between the two stories. Becca, she sees a lady looking out the window. This story, a different perspective. People who are outside looking at the window, they see a lady looking out.
Yeah. And again, we can only assume that Becca has heard some of these same stories that we're talking about. We can't say for sure, but again, even if she hadn't, the idea of seeing something out of the corner of your eye and your brain just putting that skin of nice old lady on top of whatever you're seeing, that's reasonable. It's something your brain go, oh yeah, that's fine, that's normal. And again, just to be clear for our listeners, the whole skinning theory is not like my own. That's something that I've heard many other paranormal writers and theorists talk about, specifically Josh Cutchin and Tim Renner. It's a good middle ground that you have to think about when talking about just things that are so strange. Because again, like the idea of a deadbolt locking or a child runs by you is within the normal realms of what do you expect with like ghost stories with things like this. Whenever you have multiple people seeing something and them not agreeing on what crazy thing they saw, then that's just another order of magnitude further away. And I think that considering how our interpretations on what we're seeing play a role, keeps us grounded in, like you were saying, Nick, that skeptical mindset of whether, regardless of what was up there on the balcony that those women saw, because again, we all agree they had the experience. The experience absolutely happened. But there can be a difference between how we're interpreting these things versus what may have physically been there. And both of those experiences can be either mundane or paranormal, both be true. And I just think that's a really, really fascinating story. I really like that.
Yeah.
I thank you again, Colleen. That's really,
Brennan,
really cool.
What did you think about the skeleton?
Yeah, that is an interesting, I believe Nick used the word harbinger earlier. That's a weird synchronicity, isn't it? The whole 2 months. I would be curious to know if anybody else out there has had a paranormal experience, especially at the Harmony Inn, with either this lady in white or a skeleton, and then within 2 months had a death in the family. I hope not. Again, let's hypothesize that there is an entity that shows itself as a woman in white, traditional woman in white, or a skeleton, and then is some sort of a harbinger for certain people. Boy, that would be a little bit of a dark spot on what is otherwise a pretty benign or even benevolent series of hauntings, I would say. What do you guys think?
Well, it's certainly a dark spot.
Yeah.
I mean, like you said, everything else seems not very intrusive. This would be a whole different realm where people are dying. I mean, whether or not it's causing it or if it's just
a precursor,
right?
Of some sort. Yeah.
One thing I'll say about that, though, because I did bring out, is it a harbinger, like akin to a banshee or whatnot, is Colleen, when she wrote to us, she was very clear that she had told this story several times, and it wasn't until at least a year later, she says years, so an indeterminate amount of time, but we can assume at least a good year later, she's telling it to somebody who then brings this connection to 2 months and there's a death in the family. If that had happened, she had seen this thing, this skeletal dancing thing, and she connected it with a death sooner, it might have solidified that image in her mind. Kind of what you've been alluding to, Brendan, is like our minds interpret it, and maybe then that connection with a really traumatic event made it a bigger thing. A personal experience, back in the early 90s, there was a group called Jesus Jones who had a popular song on the radio for very briefly. We were in the car and hit a deer when that song was on, and then within 6 months, that song's on the radio again, and we hit a deer, and so we stopped. Anytime that song would come on, we would immediately turn the station because it just seemed to attract deer. The connection, it made it a bigger thing, so that I would almost become nervous when that song would come on, which I was a young kid. If she had seen that skeletal thing, her father dies, that event becomes much bigger, I'd imagine. But that's not what happened. She saw this, her father died, she didn't make the connection until year or more later, somebody else relays that, somebody else who had made that connection. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. And I think that whenever you have the benefit of perspective on some of these stories and you have some sort of corroboration from other people, that leads to, I think, giving some of these synchronicities a little more weight. And I just think that's something that's absolutely worth thinking about whenever you have situations like this, for sure.
So I have a few things about this interview. We had another email from a woman named Danielle, and she also worked as a waitress at the Harmony Inn. The difference is the time frame in which she worked there. Danielle worked there, I want to say it was in the 90s. It was before the brewery.
Yeah, there was
before the current owners,
and they ran it for some years.
Right, so this would have been long before Becca worked.
Current iteration. Yeah, before Becca, before Colleen's experience, for sure. Yeah.
So Danielle gave me a list of experiences she had there, and I wrote down, I have a list I want to go through because it's kind of crazy how similar these things are. Okay, so I'm gonna start off with one of the smaller ones, and it's like a simple one. It's the things falling off the bar, getting thrown off the bar. Becca said glasses would fly off the bar.
All the time. Yeah.
Danielle said the same story. She said that one night they were actually closing and had the bar's stools turned up and one of them got pushed off.
Mm-hmm.
Which, things falling are always... What am I trying to say?
It's I would say things falling in of themselves is not necessarily a indication of paranormal activity.
Right.
Things fall apart. It's scientific.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so the next one I'm going to read because it actually covers two things that Becca had talked about. So she says, this is another daytime experience. And again, it was only the cook and I in the building. I used the restroom. When I was in the stall, the automatic paper towel holder just kept going off and off and off. I opened the stall door to the paper towels all over the floor and it suddenly stopped. I cleaned up the bathroom and went to enter the bar, and the door was locked. I had to go in the back door. Yelled at the cook for locking me out, and she was like, "What are you talking about? I'm making French fries." LOL.
No, but yeah, that's two of Becca's stories right there.
Right.
Well, and that has also happened to our a guy we know who works there now. He had been interviewed in a paper a few years ago, and he said he had also been locked in the bathroom once. Interesting.
Crazy. Yeah.
So, my one thought about that is I'm not sure if the bathroom would have been in the same area because they moved that bathroom. Even if it wasn't, it's still crazy that the paper towel thing is still happening.
Mm-hmm. Like there's spirits that have some sort of agency that play tricks on people and kind of mess with folks. Locking doors and making a paper towel dispenser go off seems to be pretty well in line with that. And this is just more evidence, I would say.
Right. And if it, say the bathroom had been moved, it would almost give it more credibility because you're changing the lighting, you're changing the overall layout of the room. So if it were something that was tripping the sensor for the paper towel dispenser, that it could have been fixed whenever they moved it, that they could have remedied the problem.
Yeah, I agree. Yep.
Okay, so I have another one that she told me about, and this also relates to a story that I know, but it was not in Becca's interview. It was actually an experience that my mom had.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So my mom was at the Harmony Inn. This was just last year. It was probably right before COVID. And she was there with her sister, and her sister went up to see the attic, and she stayed downstairs on the second floor. She was waiting for her sister to come down, and she kept hearing her sister call her name. They're both in their 50s, they know she knows her sister's voice. So finally my aunt comes down the steps and she says, "Were you calling me up there?" And she said, "No, I didn't say anything."
Dude, doppelganger stories really freak me out.
Right.
I don't like the idea of spirits being able to mimic humans in such a way that we can't tell the difference and somehow bridge that uncanny valley. Just weirds me out.
Right. So Danielle, a story that she had in here, she says, "The cook and I always thought we kept hearing each other calling each other's names. She'd storm out and say, 'What?' And I'm, 'What, huh?' And she's like, 'You were calling my name.' And I'm like, 'No, I wasn't.'"
Sounds like a comedy script, actually.
Yeah, and I mean, and that fits in with not only your mother's story, but with the kind of prankster nature that a lot of this stuff seems to have. So yeah, I mean that's right in line with a lot of this other stuff. That's so wild.
I think the neat thing about all this is the stories are cool on their own, but then you have someone else from a whole different decade essentially coming in with the same stories, and you figure whenever the new owners took over, you're probably getting a relatively new staff as well.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about all these stories is A, the number of them, B, how different they all are as far as how many different types of occurrences, but then C, like you said, just the sheer number of incidences, and they all kind of fit into a number of these buckets, whether it's the apparition stuff, whether it's the stuff moving, whether it's the locks, whether it's the bathrooms, just the sheer number of bathroom related stories I feel like is pretty crazy.
Where all my best stories start and end.
Right, exactly. And I completely agree with you, Mike, that I think that just you look at the number of occurrences, the number of variants, and how many people over such a long period of time, and whether it's being fueled by these stories just being kind of like populated and recircled through culture, or whether they're actually coming all from paranormal events that are non-interpretive. I think it's just really interesting either way.
And one thing I forgot to say about my mom's story about her hearing her sister's voice is that I know for a fact that she had not heard these stories before about the people calling
I had never
their names.
I had never heard the doppelganger stuff until recently.
Right.
So like that's not something I would have thought about if I was in that situation. If I was there and heard my brother saying my name, I wouldn't think, oh, is that the Harmony and doppelganger? Like I would have been like, what the hell does he want?
Right.
So.
And it's like you guys have said that the Harmony Inn is known and has been known for many years as being a haunted restaurant in town, and it's primed for those experiences.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think that like this is one of the rare occasions, at least in my opinion, one of the rare occasions where the hype around a place being haunted at least has such a large number of cases and experiences people have that it kind of lives up to it in that sense, which I think is rare.
For those of you interested, I know Bond and I had done an episode which we kind of touched on the Harmony Inn, as well as another place nearby. And Bond and I have another thing, Dr. Pennsylvania, which focuses on folklore and history of Pennsylvania. It's usually much briefer than what we have here, but we did talk about it then, and I had raised some doubts I had and maybe some possible origins for some of the stories, but now I'm starting to really doubt those. Just the same, if you want to check that out.
I would absolutely recommend that as well. You can find us on any the podcatchers or YouTube, Dr. Pennsylvania.
Does Dr. Pennsylvania have an Instagram?
I don't know, actually.
No, okay.
We just have the Facebook.
I was going to ask why we're not being followed by Dr. Pennsylvania as far as the Ghost Furnace podcast.
Yeah. No, we just have
because those guys are slackers.
Yeah, those guys are pushing.
You don't really want to deal with them.